If you've been here the last few weeks, you know we're walking through this series together called Believe. And again, a continuation, part of a series of series we started a couple years ago. And based on a passage of scripture we read in 1 Corinthians 16, you see it up there on the screen. An early church leader, a guy named Paul, writing to a church in Corinth that he helped start 2,000 years ago. And he had a lot of great things to say to them, summarized them all in these 5 short commands. The middle one being kind of the summary of that summary, the words be courageous or to act like men, as we said. And then he kind of unpacks that with these other 4 commands: to be on guard, to stand firm in the faith, to be strong, and to do everything with love. And we did a series about that called Be Love. We did a series about being strong called Be Strong. And we're doing a series about standing firm in the faith called Believe. And so this is what we're walking through together and talking about this idea. What does it mean to stand firm, to persevere, to continue, to hold on tight, even when life is discouraging, even when the culture that we live in becomes more and more dysfunctional and confusing? Part of being who God made us to be, part of being the men that God wants us to be, is standing firm, holding fast, persevering, not giving up on the faith, the things that God has taught us through his son Jesus, that he's revealed to us and invited us to be a part of with him. And so we're walking through a variety of topics together, all part of what we consider to be the faith that we're supposed to stand firm in. And in week 1, I shared with you those. I think we have a list up here on the screen of those topics we're going to be talking about together. Last week, we talked about the topic of theology, which is just a fancy word that describes what we believe or the doctrine of God. What do we believe about God? And last week, we kind of summarized it with a big idea that God is a triune creator on a mission to redeem the world that he made, right? And you remember us talking about that, triune, the reference to the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and that our job is to lean into him. If he is the creator, we should seek out his wisdom for how to live, and we should also seek to reflect and relate to God as he's revealed himself to us. We said we do that when we act as a family of followers on mission. And so that's what we talked about last week. We're going to continue the conversation then together tonight, talking about the second topic. This, again, fancy word up there, the word anthropology, comes from the Greek word anthropos, and it just is a reference to us, human beings, humanity, men, women. What do we think about us? What do we believe about us? What does God tell us about ourselves? And that's what we want to talk about together as we walk through this. As I said last week, when we walk through these topics, every week we're going to try to answer a couple of questions. The first question is what? And the second question is so what? And last week we did that with theology. Tonight we're going to do that with anthropology and talk about what do we believe, what does that mean for us. And if you look on the notes, again, every week I'll give you a little handout. If you haven't been here, there's some notes in the table folders that are on your tables. If you don't have those, you can take those out and fill these in as we go. But the kind of theme or the big idea, the guiding thought that we're going to use tonight as we talk about this, there's a lot of things we could talk about with anthropology, of course, but in our 30 minutes together on this, what I want to unpack for you is what actually you read in your book, if you walk through that in preparation for tonight, which is this idea you see up on the screen, that human dignity has been distorted by human depravity. And I want to unpack all of that for you. I want to talk about these 2 ideas, dignity and depravity. What do we mean by that? This idea of dignity, if you don't know what that word means just in English, it's this idea of when something has dignity, it has a certain value or worth. It's worthy of honor or respect. And one of the things we're going to talk about is that as our creator, as we mentioned last week, when God created us, he created all of us with dignity, with a sense of value and worth, deserving of honor and respect. All of us, every one of us in the room, everyone you interact with, everyone that you work with, that you live next to, all the different people of the world, of all ages throughout history, have been made with dignity. And one of the reasons that's true, or the reason we believe that's true, is this first idea I want to talk about with you tonight, which is this, that the dignity that we have, that all of us have been created with, comes from this idea that when God made us as human beings, he made us, and we'll talk about this tonight, only us, in his image. And I want to read for you where we find that. There's a few different references in the scriptures where we find this, but going back again, the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, we looked at it last week where it talked about in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. As we continue to read on in that first book, in the first chapter of that book, just actually a few verses in, verses 26 and 27, we read there a description where God, again, we believe God is one divine being, but 3 distinct persons. I think there's a kind of an allusion to that, even in these verses I want to read for you here. But it says this, that God said, let us make mankind in our what? Image, in our image. Now the us and the our, I think in some ways, is probably a reference to the Trinity that we talked about last week. One God, three distinct persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Let us make mankind, human beings, men and women, in our image. Let's make them in our likeness so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all of the wild animals. And it goes on in the next slide here. And over all the creatures that move along the ground. And so it says, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. God created them. So I want to talk to you about this. Maybe some of you have heard this concept of being made in God's image. Maybe it's a brand new idea for you tonight. We're not going to even come close to doing it justice. But I want to explain for you a little what we mean by that. It doesn't, first of all, I don't think it means that we physically look like God, which is a good thing, right? Because specimen number one up here tonight, it wouldn't be a very impressive God if he looked physically like me, and probably like most of you. There are a few of you that look better than the rest of us, but I don't think it's a reference to God physically looking like you or me, or having a face like us, or a body like us, or biceps like us, or whatever else it might be. I don't think it's a physical reflection that we're talking about here, but there is this idea that in some way, how God has made us as human beings, we were made to reflect him. In fact, the word that's translated image there in those verses that I just read for you is an interesting word. In fact, in other places in the Old Testament of the Bible, in the Hebrew language that the Old Testament books were written in, that word image there actually is used in other places to describe idols. And the way that would work is this, and try to follow along with me. Again, we're putting on our thinking caps here for a minute, but in ancient times, the people of ancient times, they didn't have all the answers that we have today. They didn't understand things scientifically. In many ways, they didn't understand things theologically the way that we do. They certainly didn't have the truth that we've been given through Jesus and through the scriptures. And so they were trying to figure God out. And who is God or the gods? And what is he like or she like or it like or what are they like? I mean, what's really going on? How do we explain this reality that we find ourselves living in? And one of the things that evolved over time for people was this, that they believed there were these kind of intersection points here on earth in our world where God would kind of dive in and be with us. And if you wanted to worship some particular God, you'd have to go to that place. And they would mark those places with buildings called temples. And you have record of archaeological evidence of temples all over the ancient world, of people setting up temples for different gods in different places and for different reasons. But they believed that in that temple, that's where whatever God they were trying to connect with or worship, that's where that God kind of lived and breathed here on earth. And so one of the things that they would do when they would build a temple, whether it was to a god or multiple gods, but they would always, in any temple they would build, they would always set up some kind of idol or some kind of image of that God in that temple. And in doing that, they did that as a reminder of this temple belongs to this particular God, and this is what that God is like. So they'd make it an image of some animal or some other creature or some weird, that doesn't really match up with anything else kind of being, but it was a way of saying this temple belongs to that God. This is where he dwells. This is where we come to worship him, and you worship that God through this image. Now, I think the people that were living thousands of years ago when the books of the Old Testament were written, this is the world they lived in. They understood that. It's probably a little foreign for most of us, but I think there's a fascinating connection that Moses, the guy that wrote these words in Genesis, and that the people of his day would have understood or connected the dots with. Part of the picture that he was trying to present in describing us as having been made in his image is this idea that for our God, for the one true God, he's actually not contained in any single temple at any single spot in the world. In fact, from their perspective, their premise would be that the whole world is his temple. That this all belongs to him, that he dwells in all of it, and we as human beings, unlike anything else in creation, we've been placed here, we've been made in his image as a reflection to each other of who all this belongs to and who dwells here and who it is that we're to worship. And not only that we were actually supposed to kind of reflect that God to each other, to be reminders of that, and we were actually to reflect the worship of all of creation to that God. They would do this all the time in ancient temples with ancient idols, and God redeems all of that and says, wait a minute, it doesn't work that way. I've actually made you as my image bearers, not that you would be worshiped, but that through you, the worship of our Creator from all of creation would come through who? Through all of us, as ones made in his image, as his image bears. And I think it was all designed for us to, again, be kind of a reflection of who God is in the way that we interact with each other, in the way that we kind of manage this creation that God has given us to live in, but also as a way as we would reflect our worship and the worship of creation to him. One of the ways that I've illustrated this in different settings, and I wish I had more time to unpack this with you tonight, is actually through a picture that I'll put up here on the screen. It's not a very fancy one and not a very elaborate one. I like to draw pictures on whiteboards and different things, and some of you have seen some of them in the past. I'm not a very good artist, which is to your advantage. I try to use this so you can use this with other people, but in some ways I try to explain this with a drawing like this that you see up there on the screen. We read last week that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and if I were drawing this for you, I'd write God. In the beginning there was God, and he created everything out of nothing, the heavens and the earth, and so I had the little sun up there as kind of the heavens, and that really fancy, elaborate, extensive line at the bottom is the earth. And then, of course, God went on from there to create the different elements and parts and pieces of creation. And so you have the plants. I have a tree and a really, really generic-looking bush up there. I don't even know what kind that would be. And then he created the animals, and that's my best stab at a bunny rabbit, which kind of looks like a skateboard or an Easter egg or something. I don't know, but you get the point. God created the heavens and the earth and the plants and the animals and everything in it. And then, as the kind of peak or pinnacle of his creating work, the final thing that God breathes into existence, unlike anything else in the creation that he had already made, it's you and it's me. And you notice I drew kind of people up there in the sky, not because we can fly, but because we're different than everything else. Because we've been made in his what? His image. And that's not just a thing about us, it's actually a vocation, a job, a responsibility that he's given to us in that as well, that unlike anything else in all of creation, we have been made to reflect God to creation and to each other in the ways that we interact, the ways that we love, the ways that we treat one another, the things that we do are to be a reflection of him, but also then we reflect the worship of creation back to our God. In some ways, we're like kind of a diagonal mirror. In fact, a few years ago, I used this line when we were talking about our kind of our identity and this idea of who God's made us to be and being made in his image. I said that we are not what we see in the mirror, which is a good thing for most of us, right? Especially the older that we get and the chubbier that we get. We're not what we see in the mirror. In fact, from God's perspective, we actually are the mirror. And we're not defined by what's reflected back to us, but rather what God has intended to reflect through us, about him, to each other, and to the world around us. We've been made, all of us, with incredible worth and value because we've been made in his image, every single one of us, you, me, and every single person you know or will know in this life, meant to reflect him. And this is, as I put there in your notes, this being made in God's image. It's unlike anything else in creation, as I said. Not the mountains, not the trees, not the oceans. They're majestic, they're magnificent, they're amazing, but none of it was made in God's image. Only you and me and people like us. Not only that, not your pets at home, your favorite dog or your favorite cat, if there can be such a thing, but they may be sweet and tender and just the love of your life, but they can never relate to you the way another person can because they're not made in God's image like you and me and every other person. Only us. This is unlike anything else in all of creation. And the other thing that I think is so important to hold on to with this is the second point that you see there, not only that it's unlike anything in all creation, but it's also unrelated to anything you might do or not do. So being made in God's image, having this value and worth, the dignity that we're talking about tonight didn't come because you earned it or deserved it or worked your way up to it or cleaned your act up enough to deserve it. It doesn't come to us that way. It's all because of how God has made us. He's a triune creator on a mission to redeem this broken world, and part of this beautiful world that he's made is you and me and every other human being in his image. And we've all been given tremendous dignity and value and worth because of that. The reason we have something here to talk about together tonight is this, though, that things didn't stay that way forever, and really they didn't even stay that way for long. Now, we all still are made in God's image. It's there, it's part of us, it's how God has made us, but there's something that's happened to it that actually keeps us blinded to the fact that we've been made as a reflection of him. And that's the second idea here, this idea of depravity. And what we're talking about with that, the image of God in us has been disguised and distorted, like camouflaged. It's hard to see. It's there in you and me and everyone else around us, but it's been disguised. There's some masks that have been put over the top. There's some disguises and, like I said, camouflage that are keeping us from seeing who we really are and who God made us to be. It's distorted. It's disfigured. It's messed around and rearranged with what God intended from the beginning. And that's happened by a couple of things: our sin and our disobedience. Now, sin isn't always a common word. It's not a one that's real popular in our day. We don't always like to talk about it or hear about it. We don't want to hear someone else talk to us about it in our lives. And yet it's so important. It's so foundational for us to understand what it is. In fact, in the Bible, one of the words that's been translated sin is actually just an archery term. And if you're familiar with that, you're trying to hit the bullseye, you're trying to hit the target when you shoot bows and arrows. And in the scriptures, one of the words that's translated sin is just a description of this idea of missing the mark, missing the target. That God had something in mind, a design, an intention for us, and when we sin, it's just a reference to us missing the mark of that and not hitting what God actually created us to be. And all of us, we've inherited that, we've all contributed to that, and because of that, our sin, our missing the mark, our disobedience against God has actually distorted and disguised and messed with and rearranged, covered up the image of God in us and in everyone else around us. To kind of illustrate that for you, again, to show you that picture that I had up there earlier, we said in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the plants and the animals, human beings in his image. And in the beginning, everything, he actually steps back and he looks at it all and he says, this is very good. And everything had its place, everything had its purpose, and when everything was in its place and fulfilled its purpose, actually one of the things that we read that scholars will talk about is that in the beginning there was this, I'll teach you another Hebrew word, maybe you've heard it before, but this word shalom. Can you say shalom? Shalom, okay, it's kind of a greeting, and if you would go to Israel today in Hebrew, it means hello or goodbye or peace, but biblically it's this idea of wholeness or being complete. When everything was in its place and fulfilling its purpose, there was this shalom, this wholeness to what God made us for and to what God set in place. The problem, though, as we read the story, is that the first man, Adam, the first woman, Eve, when they're kind of living in this new existence, they're living as image bearers of God in this temple of creation meant to reflect him to one another. They were tempted in the garden to do something. We read the story, and the kind of actual temptation is they were being tempted to eat fruit from the one tree that God told them not to eat from, which was the kind of outer edge of this, what it looked like on the outside. But the actual temptation they were faced with on the inside wasn't primarily about eating fruit they weren't supposed to. It was actually a temptation to doubt that God actually belonged in that place in this whole picture of their lives. In other words, the temptation wasn't, I really want to eat that fruit, but I shouldn't, but I'd like to eat that fruit. But the temptation was, well, God told me not to eat that fruit, but I think God either doesn't know what's best for me or he doesn't want what's best for me. And in fact, that's the wrestle that they had. We have this spiritual enemy in the form of a serpent who comes and says to the woman, Eve, did God say you can't eat that fruit? And she's like, yeah, if we do, we'll die. And he's like, you're not going to die. God only told you that because he knows if you eat it, you'll become like him. And guess what? He doesn't want anyone else to be like him. In other words, the temptation was you can't trust God to call the shots in your life because he's going to rip you off and hold you back and keep you from all sorts of good things that he just doesn't want you to have. and they fell for the temptation, and we've been battling the exact same temptation ever since. You see, our depravity, our sin, our disobedience actually comes when, on the next slide here, you'll see, when God gets removed from his proper place in all of this, and we start rearranging and moving all the other parts and pieces around. When we start to move, sometimes we move ourselves into God's place, right? And we live as though we're the ones seated on the throne, or that all of creation exists for and revolves around, that it's all about us. Or for some of us, we put other people on that kind of pedestal, and we worship and adore them, and our lives revolve around them. For some of us, it's not other people that we kind of move up and down. It's things from creation. It's the physical stuff in the world, rather than being something we steward and appreciate and we use to serve one another and to honor God. We actually let some of that stuff, the trees, the bushes, the animals, all the stuff that's part of earth, we actually let that kind of slide up and take God's rightful place in our hearts. When you think about addictions, what is an addiction? An addiction, whatever that might be for you or for me, is just something from creation rather than us kind of stewarding and managing over that as we were made to do as image bearers. It kind of controls and consumes and rules over us. And this is the depravity that we're talking about. We made a mess of all the parts and pieces, and we started to rearrange things, and rather than shalom or peace or wholeness, and rather than this kind of movement that God initiated in the beginning that was supposed to produce more and more life, we created something through our sin, through our missing the mark, through our rebellion against God, through our disobedience, that now started to lead to more and more death. Spiritual death, physical death, relationship death, emotional death. Because instead of functioning within the order that God established in the beginning that was good, in fact, he described it very good, we said we're going to do things our own way. We think we can figure this out better than he can. In fact, he might actually even be holding us back. And here's the reality for us when it comes to this. A couple things, these aren't in your notes, but a couple other things that I wanted to tell you with this. We've all been infected and we've all been affected by this. In other words, we've all been infected. This is a part of all of us. And I'm guessing for most of us in the room, I don't have to spend a lot of time convincing you of that. You know, as well as I know, that there are good things in our life, but there are some things that aren't the way they're supposed to be. And as we interact with other people in the world, interact with people around us, we realize that they may be good people, they may be nice people, they may be successful people, but when you pop the hood a little bit and you look under the surface and you begin to see who people really are and the things that we really wrestle with, it doesn't take a lot of convincing to realize you're right. We've all been infected. It's a sickness, disease that has impacted all of us on the inside. But we've also all been affected. It impacts all of us. We're kind of recipients of this because of everyone else around us as well. And the second thing I'd point out to you with that is this, that everything broken in your life and in our world is a result of this. And there's plenty of that to illustrate with, right? But everything that's broken in your life, broken relationships, broken emotions, again, it might be addictions in your life. It could be things that you keep stumbling into and failing with. It could be hurt that you're causing, hurt that other people have caused you. It's the kind of big systemic stuff that we see in our world that we watch on TV and we shake our heads. We're like, man, this world is a mess. Everything in your life and in our world that's broken is broken because of this. So what do we do about it? What does that mean for us? And that's what I want to spend the last couple quick minutes here talking about there. You see at the bottom of your notes. One of the first things that I think I want to challenge you with tonight in light of this, the depravity that has distorted our dignity as human beings, is this, that when we understand what God made us to be in the beginning and what we are and what God is trying to bring us back to, again, one of the things that I think is so important is this, is that we should always start the story with what we are instead of what we aren't. Here's what I mean by that. Well-meaning, good church people, myself included at times, whether it's for ourselves or for people around us, we so often start the story The story of God, the story of creation, the story of what God's doing in the world, the story of Jesus. We so often start it a little bit into the story. We start it with what we aren't. We start with things like we're sinners in need of a Savior, which is absolutely 100% true. I just don't think we should start the story there. I think we should start the story, instead of starting it in Genesis chapter 3 with the fall and the brokenness, let's just make sure and take one step back farther and start it in the beginning in Genesis 1 and 2 with what we were actually made to be. I think it's actually much more compelling and inspiring for us to realize there was something good we were made for in the beginning. There was something good that everyone around us was made for in the beginning, that our sin and our disobedience is robbing from us. Let's start with what God actually made us to be, with who we are that's been distorted and disguised by our sin and our disobedience. Let's start there with ourselves and with others. The second thing I want to point out is this. I think we should embrace God, the worth that God's given us, and affirm the worth that God has given others. Being made in God's image, that means that you have infinite value and worth. It's unlike anything else in all of creation. It's unrelated to anything you do or don't do. You can't earn it or deserve it. You can't lose it or give it away. God has made you in his image. And with that, you've been made with incredible dignity and value and worth. And we need to hold on to that. Pastor Ron's been talking about that in our work series, and how so many of us, we try to find the very thing God's already given to us in the things that we do and accomplish, the things that we do at work, the ladders we climb in our careers, the accomplishments that we make in a variety of areas of life. And I think one of the applications of this that we need to hold on to is we just need to embrace the value and worth that God's already given to us in making us in his image. But not only that should we embrace that for us, we should also affirm that in others. And when I say others, I mean every others around us. The people you live with, the people in your family, people in your extended family, the ones that you don't like to spend time with and can't stand being around, they're also made in God's image. And we need to affirm their value and worth in the way that we treat them and talk about them, the ways that we interact with them, the ways that we think about them. The people that live in your neighborhood, some of them it's easy to see the image of God, and others you can't fathom that there's anything of value and worth in them because of the things they do or the ways that they respond to you, and yet even they need to be affirmed in the value and worth that they have. The people that live in our country, the people that live in every other country around the world, your friends, but also your enemies. In this season, Republicans and Democrats, right? Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, whoever it's going to be on the other side. I mean, all of them made in the image of God. Maybe it's buried deep within all sorts of other things for you, for me, or for anyone else. But it's there, and we ought to embrace that value and worth ourselves and also affirm that value and worth. And there's a third thing I want to challenge you with is this, that we should remember that even with the best of us, there's still some worst of us. And I've shared this with you before, and I just want to remind you of it again. In fact, several years ago, we talked about this in our Be Strong series, that we all need a team. We need other men in our lives to help us, and keep us accountable, to challenge us, because even with the best of us, there's still somewhere in there some worst of us. And we saw a great illustration with a guy named Noah several chapters later in Genesis. If you're familiar, even if you're not a Bible reader, you probably have heard of the story of Noah and the ark and this flood, and how God, shortly after his creation and our fall that we're talking about here tonight, things got bad quickly, and God eventually said, I've got to reset some things. And he looked out over all the earth, and there was one man and one family that he thought he could start over with, a guy named Noah and his family. And so God did, and he had him build this ark, and there was this flood, and his family was spared and survived through that, and God kind of restart with them. And yet shortly after this one guy that out of all the earth God saw and thought, well, maybe I could start over with him. Even Noah, shortly after that, he planted a vineyard, he grew grapes like you do, and then he made wine like you do, and he got drunk and made a total fool of himself. And we're reminded that even with the best of us, even the people that look like they have it all together and have everything pulled together, even with the best of us, there's still some worst of us. There's some depravity that's covering up that dignity, and God is going to continue to work in our lives. That's why we need to be proactive. And One of the things that we read in our book this week is this idea that we're all prone to wander. And that's true of you, that's true of me, that's true of Pastor Ron, it's true of Billy Graham when he was here, and anyone else you could put up on a pedestal. We're all prone to wander. And rather than assuming that everything's okay until it's obviously not, I think it's important to be proactive and to lean in and to say, how do we help each other? We've got this thing, this problem that's part of all of us. How do we lean into God and let him do his work in us so that we can overcome that together? And that's the last thing that I want to point out for you, which is this, that we should remember we can't fix what we've broken, that only Jesus can do that. I know that's a cliche line and something you would expect a pastor to say, but in fact, that's one of the things we're going to talk about next week with Christology and talking about what we believe about Jesus. This is a problem that we all have been infected with and affected by, and there's nothing we can do in and of ourselves to fix it. In fact, as we'll talk next week, our only hope, and one of the challenges I hope you are reminded of or gain from this entire series, is that we're part of this big grand story where we have a triune creator who's on a mission to redeem the world, and part of his mission is to redeem and to rescue and restore you, to restore the dignity of the image of God that's in you, that God made you with. And he offers to do that only through his son, Jesus, who we're going to be talking about more next week.